What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where in this video I am going to be giving my review on the Star Wars novel Shadow of the Sith. This book is written by Adam Christopher. It is a relatively new novel, and it is set between Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and Episode 7, The Force Awakens, closer to The Force Awakens. Shadow of the Sith is probably the best Star Wars book I've ever read. Granted, there are a lot of books that I haven't read still, but I just think it's a pretty essential novel for anyone who wants more details on the sequel trilogy and the characters of that era. We get into Rey, we get into Rey's parents, we get into a lot of Rey's earlier life, and then we also follow, the book primarily follows actually Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian about 17 years after Return of the Jedi. So at this point, Rey is about 6 years old, and Ben Solo is about 16. So he's still got a ways to go before he ends up turning to the dark side, and that's where the book is set. Overall, I think this novel, again, like I said, it's fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I'm not even like a super big avid reader. I've been getting into it more over the last year or so, but just in general, like, I'm not super huge on reading, or I haven't been in the past, but now I'm looking for my next book to start. Anyways, Shadow of the Sith, a really good read and an essential story for the sequel era. So again, this book follows Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian. Essentially what happens here, the general plot is that Lando, and we're going to get into some spoilers now, Lando catches wind of this family who is being hunted by a bounty hunter who was apparently hired by the Sith. And obviously everyone thinks that the Sith are dead at this point, but as we know, they're not. Palpatine is out on Exegol, and there's a lot going on Exegol that we learn about in this book. But Lando overhears this conversation between a bounty hunter, who is Ochi of Bestoon, by the way, and a couple of other people who he ends up hiring to help him with this bounty. And so Lando ends up contacting Luke Skywalker. The mention of the Sith is enough to draw Luke's interest for sure, even though, of course, he thinks they're dead as well. And, also Lor San Tekka plays a role earlier in the novel. There's a lot of characters from the sequel era who make some appearances. Lor San Tekka, obviously Ochi of Bestoon plays a big role. Admiral Pride has a smaller role in the novel. So yeah, just in case you're wondering who else is in the book. Ben Solo has a smaller role, like he appears in the beginning and the end for a brief moment with Luke. So those moments are obviously fun and interesting to read about. But anyways, Lando and Luke, they end up going on this adventure, this mission to find this family. Luke also has another motive for being on this mission. He's more in pursuit of the Sith than he is in pursuit of the family per se, but the two missions go hand in hand for the most part. So they're looking for this family, and this family is, of course, Rey and her parents. We learn Rey's parents' names. We learn some more history about both her mother and her father, how her father escaped from Exegol and all that. We get into Rey's mother, and also there's mention of Rey's grandmother, and it seems like they're trying to suggest that Rey's grandmother is not necessarily Force sensitive, but maybe she was. There's something unique about Rey's grandmother, and they sort of allude to that, but they never really get into it. So we get some more backstory on that. We get some backstory on Rey's earlier years when her family was actually living on Jakku, peacefully at that point, and then we find out, why they're on the run, and basically the book, from their perspective, or as it pertains to Rey and her family, is just about them being on the run from the Sith. And then with Luke and Lando, they're in pursuit of this family. Lando he feels especially passionate about this mission because Lando had a daughter who was taken from his arms when she was very young, and he's been looking for her ever since. So this, what this family is going through really resonates with him. So that's what the main plot of the book is about. Obviously, Palpatine looms large over the story, although none of the characters, or at least none of the characters besides Rey's father and her mother, know that he is alive. But his presence still looms. So that's obviously a big part of it. There's a lot of different things that go on in this book, right? I made a video on the interaction between Luke and Anakin. I also made one on the funeral that Luke and Lando have for Rey's parents. I would say the main characters in the book are Luke and Lando for sure, and then to a lesser degree Ochi of Bestoon, and then Rey and her parents. That's what the story is centered on for sure. Luke and Lando are the two prominent characters, though. R2-D2 is also in it. He accompanies Luke and Lando on this mission, and there is another character who emerges who has some history with Luke and ends up helping them as well. I really think that the big thing with this book is that it makes certain things that happen in the sequels mean a lot more. It adds a lot of meaning to them. So like in The Last Jedi, when Rey arrives on Ahch-To and she's trying to convince Luke to come back, Luke appears to think that there's something unique about Rey that he may be familiar with, but he never says it. And this book makes it very clear that whatever Luke was possibly suspecting, although he may have thought it was impossible at that point, he was correct. Luke has history with Rey's family, with Rey. Although they never met before, he was looking for her and he almost found her. So that's a really, really big deal. And there's lots of tie-ins to The Rise of Skywalker. I'd say that's the movie that is most impacted by this book, but really the entire sequel trilogy. It gives us a lot of insight into a lot of different things. Primarily, obviously the story of Luke in pursuit of Rey's family, Lando losing his daughter and continuing to look for her, which it sounds like he's going to continue to do even after this book because they do not find her during this novel. And then you also have some mentions of Luke's Jedi Order and how he is conducting himself and how he's making some of the same mistakes that the Jedi of the past made. For example, the Jedi of this era are still pretty much forbidden from attachment. Ben Solo actually, multiple times throughout the novel, comes to Luke and he calls him Uncle Luke, and Luke corrects him. He's like, I'm not your uncle. Like, he is his uncle, and they both know that, obviously, but Luke wants Ben to refer to him as master, not uncle. The familial ties are something that Luke wants to cut in terms of Ben's Jedi training. There's still a recognition that they are related. There's a moment at the end of the novel where Ben calls him Uncle Luke and Luke just kind of lets it slide. So there's a decent relationship there, but we can kind of see how Luke's dedication to trying to rebuild the Jedi Order in the way that he thinks it should be built, which is similar to how it was built before, affects Ben Solo and kind of alienates him in a way. Again, Ben doesn't have any dark moments in this novel. He's just 16-year-old Ben Solo, a very promising and powerful young Jedi, and he's trying to make his uncle happy, and I mean, that's really it. He's not the main character of this book in any way, but that's kind of the main point or main message that's driven home about him in this novel, if there was one to take away. There are also some tie-ins to other Star Wars novels that I have read, like the Aftermath trilogy. There's a character who appears briefly in the Aftermath trilogy, for sure in the third book, I don't know when else she appears, who plays a role in this novel. So that kind of stuff is interesting, but I definitely do not think that you need to have read any other Star Wars books before reading this one. I think it's a pretty easy read. It's an easy one to follow, assuming you have just seen the movies. That's really all you need. So it's an immersive story. It follows the main characters that we already know about. You don't need any backstory, and it's just a really, really fun and interesting story. And there's definitely some major tragedy in there as well, which we've already covered in a couple of the other videos that I've made about the book, or about some things that happen in the book. And yeah, I mean, the ending is really, really sad. The ending definitely adds to the tragedy of Rey's life in particular, because it just shows you how close she was, how close the galaxy was to having a totally different outlook. Rey was so close to being found, her parents were so close to being saved, and it ultimately ends in complete tragedy. And of course, the book was restricted by that, of course, because we know what happens in The Rise of Skywalker. It couldn't have done anything else, but it's interesting how closely they tie in with The Rise of Skywalker. It's just, it's really awesome, and I'm not going to get into everything that happens in the book and whatnot, but it's a really good story, man. That's all I can really say. My favorite character in the book, I would say, is probably Luke Skywalker, just because Luke is one of my favorite characters, and it's so fun to learn more about him in his prime years. You know, he's a little bit older now, actually, a little bit past his physical prime, but in terms of him being the great Jedi Master we all hear about and fantasize about and the galaxy looks up to, Luke Skywalker, this is him. You know, this is him at his peak, and he gets some action scenes, and it's a good book for him. I enjoyed learning the most about Rey and her parents, I would say, because that was like where most of the unknown things came from. The backstory about her parents and how she was ultimately separated, why her parents took her back to Jakku, that's answered in this novel, and it definitely makes sense, and it really works. Again, I'm not saying that like you have to read this book in order to understand the sequel trilogy, because to me the sequel trilogy is understandable on its own. The sequels make perfect sense to me and they're great movies, but I'm telling you that this book is going to, if you're somebody who enjoys the sequels, this book is going to add to that tremendously. If you're somebody who just likes the sequels, but you're like, this kind of, I need some more tie-ins, this book is where it's at. It's not that I would say like I'm mad or anything that it wasn't made into a show or something, because obviously it still could be too. But even if it's not, I think books are a great medium of storytelling. So I would never say that I think they shouldn't have made a book about this or anything like that. I'm just saying that this story is it's very important for anyone who wants to know more. Again, you don't have to read it to understand anything, but it's going to add a lot to the story for you, just as any good book should. Ochi of Bestoon is also he's definitely the villain of this book. But there's a lot of like insight into the character. There's history about him in his earlier years when he was still a Jedi hunter during like the Clone Wars and whatnot. There's even a flashback to him hunting a particular Jedi. But what's most revealing actually is Ochi and his relationship, or not necessarily a relationship, but the almost possessive nature of the Sith dagger that Rey finds in The Rise of Skywalker. That was Ochi's blade, but before it was given to Ochi, it wasn't always Ochi's. It was given to him by some Sith loyalists who came and recruited him from Exegol. And the Sith dagger is not just a dagger. It has dark powers and seemingly possessive powers. And it makes Ochi do some things that it's suggested perhaps maybe he wouldn't have done if he was just operating under his own will completely. Although, like, regardless, he's still a bad person. And I'm not saying that he wouldn't have killed Rey's parents or he wouldn't have done this, that, or the other thing in the book. But the dagger has like its own thirst for blood. And the dagger is the dark side of the Force, Just like a Sith connects to his lightsaber, a Jedi connects to his lightsaber, and those weapons are almost sentient in a way. Like the kyber crystals are sentient, and the weapons, like, they hold power within them. And there's also a mask in this book that is worn by one of the other villains in the story, and it literally possesses her, like way more than the dagger ever does to Ochi. And this is like a concept that comes back from Legends too. I think there was something with Darth Nihilus, like he like lived on in his mask after he died, or at least some people thought that. It's kind of that concept. There's a mask from a Sith Lord from a long time ago, and this other villain wears it, and it literally like possesses her. So that kind of stuff is really interesting to get into. I like to get into the Sith lore in that way, and Luke learns a lot about this stuff. So there's a lot of insight as far as as far as the kind of revelations that Luke makes about the Jedi and the Sith and all of this stuff. Because the thing about Luke Skywalker that's different than the Jedi who came before is, yes, he has the guidance of the Force ghosts. Yes, he has an interaction with Anakin in this movie, but for the most part, Luke is teaching himself. So Luke is learning while he's also rebuilding the Jedi Order. So he's not Luke is the Jedi Master. Luke is still definitely one of the most powerful Force users ever. And he does have some guidance from Obi-Wan and Yoda and Anakin. But ultimately, Luke is on his own. So, like, he's scouring the galaxy. He's been searching the galaxy for all these years with Lor San Tekka a lot of the time, and they find these artifacts in these texts, and Luke learns about the Jedi, and ultimately that's how he incorporates those teachings and those lessons into his own reconstruction of his Jedi Order. And that's really interesting, and we delve into a little of that in this book as well. There's some Sith kyber crystals that are a pivotal or a very prized possession for the Sith. The Sith are after them, and Luke gets to them first. So the Sith they kind of go in pursuit of Luke as well. And I keep saying the Sith, basically the other villain in this story outside of Ochi is a girl who was a member of the Acolytes of the Beyond, who is like a dark side cult group after Return of the Jedi. And she wears this mask from the old Sith Lord, and she wields a lightsaber from a different Sith Lord called Darth Noctis, and she comes after Luke. And so that's the other mission that Luke kind of breaks off from Lando for a brief moment in the novel, and that's toward the end, but for most of the novel they're together, and they come back together at the end of the novel. As far as other characters who appear, there are not any appearances from or mentions of like Leia or Han or Chewbacca. No characters like that, I don't think, that I can remember, but it doesn't need it. The story isn't really related to them at all. If I had to pick one line from the novel that just like sticks out to me, there may have been some other lines that I read and I thought they were cool, and maybe those would be my favorite lines if I really went through and analyzed. But the one line that just stands out in my head from this novel was when Palpatine actually reaches out to Ochi of Bestoon, and he tells Ochi that he's alive, basically. And Ochi, is dumbfounded, and he's like, that's not possible. And Palpatine says, all things are possible, Ochi of Bestoon. And that's probably my favorite line from this entire book, just because it's just very fitting for Palpatine to say something like that, and it's really cool. The context of the conversation obviously matters, but that's probably my favorite line from the novel, just in terms of what I can remember off the top of my head anyway. So yeah, that's going to wrap it up for me. Again, if you haven't gotten the point yet, Shadow of the Sith, in my opinion, is an absolutely amazing book, and I think it's a very, very worthwhile read. I don't think you will regret it, whether you get the audiobook or you actually read it. Personally, I got a hard copy and I read the book. But yeah, either way, I'm sure it's pretty much the same experience, and I think you'll really, really love it. I'm not generally somebody who goes back and reads books more than once, but if there was a book that I was going to do that with, it would probably be this one. Again, really immersive story, really fun read, really adds to a lot of the things that take place in the sequel trilogy, and just a fun adventure for Luke and Lando, and a sad, tragic story for Rey and her parents. And yeah, so that's going to wrap things up for me, honestly. That's kind of my review. I don't want to ramble here too much more and just kind of continue telling you that I really like this book. So thank you all for tuning in. If you are somebody who is into reading and you're looking for a book, or you're considering buying Shadow of the Sith, I would definitely recommend it. I think you'll have a good time with it. But that will wrap things up for me, so thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, please let me know in the comments section below. Have a wonderful day wherever you may be, and of course, may the Force be with you always.